Propaganda. Countries such as Italy and Argentina, which once had powerful propaganda systems, no longer use this weapon. Whatever the diversity of countries and methods, they have one characteristic in common: concern with effectiveness. Footnote: Goebbels said, "We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect." And F.C. Bartlett accurately states that the goal of propaganda is not to increase political understanding of events, but to obtain results through action. Propaganda is made, first of all, because of a will to action, for the purpose of effectively arming policy and giving irresistible power to its decisions. Footnote: Harold D. Lasswell's definition of the goal of propaganda is accurate: to maximize the power at home by subordinating groups and individuals while reducing the material cost of power. Similarly, in war, propaganda is an attempt to win victory with a minimum of physical expense. Before the war, propaganda is a substitute for physical violence. During the war, it is a supplement to it. Whoever handles this instrument can be concerned solely with effectiveness. This is the supreme law, which must never be forgotten when the phenomenon of propaganda is analyzed. Ineffective propaganda is no propaganda. This instrument belongs to the technological universe, shares its characteristics, and is indissolubly linked to it. Not only is propaganda itself a technique, it is also an indispensable condition for the development of technical progress and the establishment of a technological civilization. And, as with all techniques, propaganda is subject to the law of efficiency. But whereas it is relatively easy to study a precise technique, whose scope can be defined, the study of propaganda runs into some extraordinary obstacles. From the outset, it is obvious that there is great uncertainty about the phenomenon. Diffuse forms of propaganda. Countries such as Italy and Argentina, which once had powerful propaganda systems, no longer use this weapon. Whatever the diversity of countries and methods, they have one characteristic in common: concern with effectiveness. Footnote: Goebbels said, "We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect." And F.C. Bartlett accurately states that the goal of propaganda is not to increase political understanding of events, but to obtain results through action. Propaganda is made, first of all, because of a will to action, for the purpose of effectively arming policy and giving irresistible power to its decisions. Footnote: Harold D. Lasswell's definition of the goal of propaganda is accurate: to maximize the power at home by subordinating groups and individuals while reducing the material cost of power. Similarly, in war, propaganda is an attempt to win victory with a minimum of physical expense. Before the war, propaganda is a substitute for physical violence. During the war, it is a supplement to it. Whoever handles this instrument can be concerned solely with effectiveness. This is the supreme law, which must never be forgotten when the phenomenon of propaganda is analyzed. Ineffective propaganda is no propaganda. This instrument belongs to the technological universe, shares its characteristics, and is indissolubly linked to it. Not only is propaganda itself a technique, it is also an indispensable condition for the development of technical progress and the establishment of a technological civilization. And, as with all techniques, propaganda is subject to the law of efficiency. But whereas it is relatively easy to study a precise technique, whose scope can be defined, the study of propaganda runs into some extraordinary obstacles. From the outset, it is obvious that there is great uncertainty about the phenomenon.
Okay, so we're here. This is an interesting week. The last couple weeks have been really, really fun. Today we're going to be reading from Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. And I think that a lot of people really enjoyed the most recent video I did where I just basically read from my favorite books and outlined some of my favorite books for propaganda. So I think that it would be a good idea to just go ahead and do some live reading because, I mean, these books are very interesting. They can be a little dry, they can be a little like overly analytical also. They're not, it's not the same as like binge watching something. So I wanted to read from the book. This book, um, I think this book is pretty amazing in a sense that it gives you a look at the mindset. This one right here gives you a look at the mindset of someone creating propaganda, what they anticipate, how it's going to interact with society, how they're going to go about producing the desired effects, because propaganda that does not produce the outcome that you intend is not really propaganda. It's not about convincing people to believe in something. The belief is only necessary to the extent that you can achieve the outcome you want. If you're just there to convince people to believe anything and it doesn't really result in any appreciable change in their actions or behaviors, and ultimately the desired outcome of increased political control or change to social structures and behaviors, then what's the point? There's no point. It's not really worth it. Like, you can get people to believe a lot of things, but if they're not going to act on that belief, then there's really no point. And so many people get mixed up in thinking that it's about convincing people of something. People work against their best interests all the time. They go against their own personal beliefs, their own opinions all the time. So simply getting someone to believe something is kind of irrelevant unless that belief will directly tie into changes in their actions. So I thought that was an interesting part that most people generally do not get, and they don't really pick up on. They actually don't. They don't really pick up on that part. They get so tied up in, oh, this is how it should be, and I'm going to trick someone into doing something. And it's like, okay, whatever. So, to get into the book, this book was reprinted in 1965. Let's see, of the 1965. So, I think this is from, when was this originally published? I think the original publish of the book was a little bit earlier, because I don't think, let me see, when was it originally original? It's so hard to find these things. Oh, it was foreign. Okay, so it was just published in 1962. Not so bad. So they had time to reflect on a lot of the modern propaganda. So there's a progression in the advancement of society, how much people actually get involved in media and how much access they have to media, how much that plays a role in their life. That has changed dramatically since the turn of the century, the early 1900s. And so we have this population of people who are really, really being engineered to produce a certain outcome, which was not really the case before. So, okay, let's get into it right now, because I want to start with just going through chapter 1, and there's a lot to cover. Trust me. In the introduction and chapter 1, there's a lot to cover. So that's what I wanted to read today. And then through several weeks, we can go through. There's a lot highlighted in this book. There's a lot of golden nuggets. It's very dense, which I really like. You don't really find little books like this that are so dense and so insightful. And again, it's about, when you study propaganda, you have to break out of your mindset as a person who consumes propaganda, or maybe you have this reflexive behavior of spreading propaganda inadvertently. Maybe you do that, but you're not really designing the campaign. You're not really setting the objectives. You're sort of just going along with the flow. So, this is what I like so much about this book is it gives you that perspective that is often missed, which is critical because if you do want to, you know, protect yourself from propaganda, you should probably understand how they think and how they go about running their campaigns. Okay. So let's go with starting with the preface. The preface. Okay. I think this will be fun. It's just so dense. Okay. I'm just going to go through all of it because actually. Okay. So let's get started. So propaganda, by whatever name we may call it, has become a very general phenomenon in the world, in the modern world. Differences in political regimes matter little. Differences in social levels are more important. And most important is national self awareness. In the world today, there are three great propaganda blocks. And obviously, this book is written in 1960. So there's been a change, there's been an evolution to propaganda campaigns, but it's good to read these books because they give you a context and you can see the gradual progression, the reuse and retooling of the different propaganda tactics now that we have like things like social media and all this new technology. So a lot of these older tactics evolve and adapt and are, retooled for the new technologies we have. So the three great propaganda blocks, the USSR, China, I like that they call it that, the USSR, China, and the United States. These are the most important propaganda systems in terms of scope, depth, and coherence. Incidentally, they represent three entirely different types and methods of propaganda. So that's the other thing that people don't take into account. Propaganda has different flavors, it has different methods and methodologies. It's not a one size fits all. Oh, they made up stories and they're just lying to us. That's not how it works. Let me see. I don't have any comments on. Let me double check the comments because I don't have them going. Okay. Let's see. And it's really important to keep that in mind because you might think you recognize one form of propaganda. You think you recognize how this works, what are the telltale characteristics. But if you don't understand the underlying tactical methods, you're not going to get it. Okay. Next are the propaganda systems in various stages of development and effectiveness, but less advanced than in the three of a whole group of countries. These are the socialist republics of Europe and Asia, Poland. So he's going through the different areas. They modeled their propaganda on the SSR. There are West Germany, Spain, Egypt, South Vietnam, and Korea with less elaborate and rather diffuse forms of propaganda. Countries such as Italy and Argentina, which once had powerful propaganda systems, no longer use this weapon. Whatever the diversity of countries and methods, they have one characteristic in common, concerned with effectiveness. Propaganda is made, first of all, because of a will to action, for the purpose of effectively arming policy and giving irresistible power to its decisions. And this is when we can quote Goebbels in saying that we do not talk to say something, which most people do. We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect. The goal of propaganda is not to increase political understanding of events, but to obtain results through action. Do you get it? I know that seems like obvious, but it's not really that obvious. Because if let's say on an individual level, when you're talking to someone, when you're trying to convey information and convince them and help them see the light for something, most of the time people are talking just to say something. They're talking just to prove that they're right. When in fact, what's the outcome? So you convince them. Let's say you convince them of whatever it is you're trying to convince someone. What do you want them to do with that information? Just sit there and be like, oh, okay, you're right. What does that achieve? What does that matter? And that's the trick. That's the thing that makes people so different from a propagandist and just someone talking to talk. Okay, now they acknowledge, now what? Do you want them to go put a flag up? Do you want them to go to a certain store? Do you want them to volunteer for an action? Like, what do you want them to do? Now that you convince them, congratulations. Now what do they do? And that's the practical aspect that can transform society, is having a clear goal in mind of what you actually want them to do. Okay. Whoever handles this instrument can be concerned solely with effectiveness. This is the supreme law, which must never be forgotten when the phenomenon of propaganda is analyzed. Ineffective propaganda is no propaganda. This instrument belongs to the technological universe, shares its characteristics, and is insolubly linked to it. Not only is propaganda itself a technique, it is also an indispensable condition for the development of technical progress and the establishment of a technological civilization. So, this ties into Bernays and his whole idea that you have to manufacture consent. It's like necessary component. They never thought of them as doing something bad necessarily. They're just trying to create a society. This goes back to even Plato. They didn't think that the average person could really think or do or had any input that was really valid. They just they needed to manufacture and direct them. And as with all techniques, propaganda is subject to the law of efficiency. But whereas it is relatively easy to study a precise technique whose scope can be defined, a steady propaganda runs into some extraordinary obstacles. So here we go. This is the difficult part. Where it is relatively easy to study a precise technique whose scope is defined, a study of propaganda runs into some extraordinary obstacles. It's everything and nothing. From the outset, it is obvious that there is a great uncertainty about the phenomenon itself, arising first of all from its primordial or political concepts. Propaganda is usually regarded as an evil. This in itself makes a study difficult. To study anything properly, one must put aside ethical judgments, and this is very true. Perhaps an objective study will lead us back to them, but only later and with the full cognizance of the facts. So, he's touching on the fact that most people have so much bias around propaganda and they think they know what propaganda is that it makes it relatively difficult for them to actually study propaganda and recognize it because they have this negative connotation. They think it's evil. So, that makes you shut down right away. You're not going to be aware of certain things. You're going to have blinders up. A second source of confusion in the general conviction derived from the past experience that propaganda consists mainly of tall stories, dissemination by means of lies. To adopt this view is to prevent oneself from understanding anything about the actual phenomenon, which is very different from what it was in the past. Even when these obstacles have been removed, like essentially even when you remove these biases, it is still very difficult to determine what constitute propaganda in our world and what the nature of propaganda is. This is because it is a secret action. The temptation is then twofold: that everything is propaganda, because everything in the political or economic sphere seems to be penetrated and molded by this force, or, as certain modern American social scientists have done, to abandon the term propaganda altogether because it cannot be defined with any degree of precision. Either course is inadmissible intellectual surrender. He's really funny. I like the way he puts things. To adopt either attitude would lead us to abandon the study of a phenomenon that exists and needs to be defined. So, don't worry if propaganda seems elusive and hard to distinguish or define. It is. It is for everyone. So, you're not alone. When we come up against the extreme difficulty of definition, we can immediately discard such simplistic definitions as propaganda is any effort to change opinions or attitudes. The propagandist is anyone who communicates his ideas with the intent of influencing his listener. Such a definition would include the teacher, the priest, indeed any person conversing with another on any topic. So, obviously, every time you talk to someone can't be propaganda. Every time you have a conversation can't be propaganda, which is way too broad. Such a broad definition clearly does not help us to understand the specific character of propaganda. As far as definitions are concerned, there has been a characteristic evolution in the United States. From the 1920s to about 1933, the main emphasis was on the psychological. Propaganda is a manipulation of psychological symbols, having goals of which the listener is not conscious. So, some of the elements of this definition: the secret character of the sources and goals of propaganda, the intention to modify opinions, the dissemination of conclusions of doubtful validity, the notion of inculcating ideas rather than explaining them. This is partially correct but outdated. Since the appearance of Laswell's studies, propaganda by other means and with stated objectives has been considered possible. Attention then became focused on the intention of the propagandist. In more recent books, the aim to indoctrinate, particularly in regard to political, economic, and social matters, has been regarded as the hallmark of propaganda. Within this frame of reference, one could determine what constitutes propaganda by looking at the propagandist, such as such and such a person is a propagandist, therefore his words and deeds are propaganda. But it appears that American authors eventually accepted the definition given by the Institute of Propaganda Analysis and inspired by Laswell. Propaganda, and this is the definition, propaganda is the expression of opinions or actions carried out deliberately by individuals or groups with a view to influencing the opinions or actions of other individuals or groups for a predetermined end and through psychological manipulations. So, I don't know. That seems to me pretty accurate because propaganda is usually not carried out by one person, it's usually a combined effort. So, again, the definition from the Institute of Propaganda Analysis is propaganda is the expression of opinions or actions carried out deliberately by individuals or groups with the view to influencing the opinions or actions of other individuals or groups for predetermined ends and through psychological manipulation. So they're not being, it's not a normal conversation. Psychological manipulation is not a normal conversation. We could quote definitions for pages on end. An Italian author, Antonio Miotti, said that propaganda is a technique of social pressure which tends to create psychological or social groups with a unified structure across the hegemony of the affective and mental states of the individuals under consideration. A well-known American specialist says it's an attempt to modify personalities and control the behavior of the individuals in relation to goals considered non scientific or of doubtful value in a specific society and time period. And we could find and we would find even more remote definitions if we examine the German or Russian literature on the subject. So he will not give a definition of his own here. I wanted to show the uncertainty among specialists on the question. I consider it more useful to proceed with the analysis of the characteristics of propaganda as an existing sociological phenomenon. It is perhaps proper to underline this term. We should examine propaganda in both its past and present forms, for obviously we cannot eliminate from our society the highly developed propaganda systems of Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, and fascist Italy. This seems obvious, but is not. Many writers do not agree with this approach. They establish a certain image or definition of propaganda and proceed to study of whatever corresponds with their definition. Or yielding to the attraction of a scientific study, they try to experiment with some particular method of propaganda on small groups and in small doses, at which moment it ceases to be propaganda. I just, it's so ephemeral. It's such a bizarre thing, honestly. And it's such a unique phenomenon in society, honestly, because if you think about it, propaganda is dramatically different than what it was before and what it was capable of before. Before you had these sort of social structures making sure to engineer society and hold in place certain standards and behaviors. And now we have technology, we have all this information spreading everywhere that can rapidly evolve society, that can rapidly change society without any sort of resistance. To Okay, getting back to it. To study propaganda, we must turn not to the psychologist, but to the propagandist. I agree. We must examine not a test group, but a whole nation subjected to real and effective propaganda. Of course, this excludes all so called scientific, that is, statistical, types of study. But at least we shall have respected the objective of our study. Unlike many present day specialists who establish a rigorous method of observation, but in order to apply it, lose the object to be studied. Rather, we shall consider what the nature of propaganda is, wherever it is applied, and wherever it is dominated by concern for effectiveness. Okay, I'm going to take a break.
Diffuse forms of propaganda. Countries such as Italy and Argentina, which once had powerful propaganda systems, no longer use this weapon. Whatever the diversity of countries and methods, they have one characteristic in common: concern with effectiveness. Footnote: Goebbels said, "We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect." And F.C. Bartlett accurately states that the goal of propaganda is not to increase political understanding of events, but to obtain results through action. Propaganda is made, first of all, because of a will to action, for the purpose of effectively arming policy and giving irresistible power to its decisions. Footnote: Harold D. Laswell's definition of the goal of propaganda is accurate: to maximize the power at home by subordinating groups and individuals while reducing the material cost of power. Similarly, in war, propaganda is an attempt to win victory with a minimum of physical expense. Before the war, propaganda is a substitute for physical violence. During the war, it is a supplement to it. Whoever handles this instrument can be concerned solely with effectiveness. This is the supreme law, which must never be forgotten when the phenomenon of propaganda is analyzed. Ineffective propaganda is no propaganda. This instrument belongs to the technological universe, shares its characteristics, and is indissolubly linked to it. Not only is propaganda itself a technique, it is also an indispensable condition for the development of technical progress and the establishment of a technological civilization. And, as with all techniques, propaganda is subject to the law of efficiency. But whereas it is relatively easy to study a precise technique, whose scope can be defined, the study of propaganda runs into some extraordinary obstacles. From the outset, it is obvious that there is great uncertainty about the phenomenon.
Okay. Okay, back. Oh my god, I need to get some water. My throat was so dry. Okay. So we're only on, let's see. It's like 3 pages. It's like so much. I don't know if we'll probably just do the preface. Preface. Is the first chapter is pretty long in terms of what it covers. So I'll see how long I can go for this because it takes a little bit of time to reflect on what they say. So we'll see. Okay. Um so let's go. Resuming. So the prime concern of propaganda is obviously for effectiveness. So finally we take the term propaganda in its broadest sense so that it embraces the following areas: psychological action, psychological warfare, re-education, public and human relations. These are areas that propaganda primarily seeks to affect. So, with psychological action, the propagandist seeks to modify opinions by purely psychological means. Most often, he pursues a semi educated objective and addresses himself to his fellow citizens. Under psychological under psychological warfare, here the propagandist is dealing with a foreign adversary whose morale he seeks to destroy by psychological means so that the opponent begins to doubt the validity of his beliefs and actions. So we see psychological warfare all the time, like constantly. That's pretty that's pretty pronounced. Re-education and brainwashing. Complex methods of transforming an adversary into an ally, which can be used only on prisoners. I don't know. I've seen a lot of psychological re-education and brainwashing that's been carried out. I mean, if you think about COVID, they were able to do that because people were just sitting at home watching the news. So re-education was able to happen pretty quickly, pretty effectively. So public and human relations. These must necessarily be included. Oh God. I hate when it does this. Always searches. But public and human relations. These must necessarily be included in propaganda. This statement may shock some readers, but we shall show that these activities are propaganda because they seek to adapt the individual to a society, to a living standard, to an activity. They serve to make him conform, which is the aim of all propaganda. Just to make you conform, make you act right. It's so fun. Oh my God, struggling. It's so dry out here. All right. Propaganda, in its broad sense, includes all of these: the psychological action, the psychological warfare, re education and brainwashing, and public and human relations. In the narrow sense, it is characterized by an institutional quality. In propaganda, we find techniques of psychological influence combined with techniques of organization and the envelopment of people with the intention of sparking action. This, then, will be the broad field of our inquiry. So basically, he's looking at propaganda in terms of psychological influence and the technique and organization of it, which makes sense. From From this complete universe of propaganda, I have deliberately excluded the following subjects found in most propaganda studies: historical accounts of propaganda, particularly of the recent past, propaganda in the 1940s, 1914 to 1940, and so forth, propaganda in public opinion as an entity, considering public opinion, its formation, and so forth as the major problem, and propaganda as a simple instrument for forming or changing opinion as the minor problem. Psychological foundations of propaganda: on what prejudices, drives, motivations, passions, complexes does the propagandist play? What psychic forces does he utilize to obtain his result? The techniques of propaganda. The techniques of the propaganda, and how does the propagandist put the psychic forces into action? How can he reach people? How can he induce them to act? And the media propaganda, the mass media of communication. Such are the 5 chapter headings found everywhere. Well, not really. I don't think there's too many people talking about those things. Somewhat less common are studies on the characteristics of the great examples of propaganda: Stalinist, American, Hitlerite. I didn't know that was a term. And so on. These are omitted here precisely because they have been frequently analyzed. The reader will find in a bibliography all the useful know-how of each of these questions. I try to examine aspects of propaganda very rarely treated, to adopt a point of view, a perspective, an unorthodox view. I have sought to use a method that is neither abstract nor statistical, but occasionally relies on existing studies. The reader should know that he is not dealing with an encyclopedia propaganda, but with a work that assumes his familiarity with its psychological foundations, techniques, and methods, and that endeavors to bring the contemporary man a step closer to an awareness of propaganda, the very phenomenon that conditions and regulates him. On the other hand, I have considered propaganda as a whole. It is usual to pass ethical judgments on its ends, judgments that then rebound on propaganda, considered as a means, such as because democracy is good and a dictatorship is bad, propaganda serving a democracy is good, even if, as a technique, it is identical with the propaganda serving a dictatorship. Or because socialism is good and fascism is bad, propaganda is not altogether evil in the hands of socialists, but is totally evil in fascist hands. I repudiate this attitude. Propaganda as a phenomenon is essentially the same in China or the Soviet Union or the United States or Algeria. Techniques tend to align themselves with one another. The media of dissemination may be more or less perfected, more or less directly used, just as organizations may be more or less effective. But that does not change the heart of the problem. Those who accept the principle of propaganda and decide to utilize it will inevitably employ the most effective organization and methods. Moreover, the premise of this book is that propaganda, no matter who makes it, be the most upright and best intention of men, have certain identical results in communism or Hitlerism or Western democracy, inevitable results on the individual or groups, and different from the doctrine proposed or the regime supported by that propaganda. In other words, Hitlerism as a regime has certain effects, and the propaganda used by the Nazis undeniably had different specific characteristics. But whereas most analysis step at this specificity, I have tried to eliminate it in order to look at the most general characteristics, the effects common to all cases, to all methods of propaganda. Therefore, I have adopted the same perspective and the same method in study that propaganda has in terms of technique. I shall devote much space to the fact that propaganda has become an inescapable necessity for everyone. In this connection, I've come upon a source of much misunderstanding. Modern man worships facts. That is, he accepts facts as the ultimate reality. He is convinced that what is good. He believes that facts in themselves provide evidence and proof, and he willingly subordinates values to them. That's really interesting. That's really interesting because people right now are not really guided by God in my throat. People right now are not really guided so much by what's right or what's wrong. They're just going from a moral perspective. They're more just going on what seems to be the idea of what's right or wrong, or what factual information they believe to be correct. They're not really driven by principle. And it's really unfortunate because if people were more driven by principle, we probably wouldn't have so many issues that we have. So modern man worships facts. That is, he accepts facts as the ultimate reality. He is convinced that what is good. He believes that facts in themselves provide evidence and proof, and he willingly subordinates values to them. He obeys what he believes to be necessity, which he somehow connects with the idea of progress. This stereotyped ideological attitude inevitably results in a confusion between the judgments of probability and judgments of value. Because fact is the sole criteria, it must be good. Consequently, it is assumed that anyone who states a fact, even without passing judgment on it, is therefore in favor of it. Anyone who asserts, simply stating a judgment of probability, that the communists will win some election is immediately considered pro-communist. Anyone who says that all human activity is increasingly dominated by technology is viewed as a technocrat, and so on. So this is when I think he's saying that we're devolving into a point where we have an inability to decipher information, analyze information. We just sort of regurgitate it and assume that that's an opinion. It's the separation between analyzing things and just taking it as gospel and believing that's what they stand for. You can say something is true, but that doesn't mean you think that it should exist or you support it or want it to be. As we proceed to analyze the development of propaganda, to consider its inescapable influence in the modern world and its connection with all structures of our society, the reader will be tempted to see an approval of propaganda, because propaganda is presented as a necessity. Such a work would therefore force the author to make propaganda, to foster it, to intensify it. I want to emphasize that nothing is further from my mind. Such an assumption is possible only by those who worship facts and power. In my opinion, necessity never establishes legitimacy. The world of necessity is a world of weakness, a world that denies man. To say that a phenomenon is necessary means to me that it denies man. Its necessity is proof of its power, not proof of its excellence. Interesting. I like the way you put that too. Okay. However, confronted by a necessity, man must become aware of it if he is to master of it. As long as man denies as long as man denies the inevitability of a phenomenon, as long as he avoids facing up to it, he will go astray. He will delude himself by submitting to the fact that necessity, while pretending that he is free in spite of it, and simply because he claims to be free. Only when he realizes his delusion will he experience from the beginning of genuine freedom. In the act of realization itself, be it only from the effect to stand back and look squarely at the phenomenon and reduce it to raw fact. Okay. He's just trying to deal with these people who think that everything that exists is somehow legitimate. Just because, I mean, you see it all the time. Just because something happened in the past or just because something exists doesn't mean it's actually good or legitimate. It just sort of is. Who cares? The force of propaganda is a direct attack against man. The question is to determine how great is the danger. Most replies are based on unconscious a priori dogmas. Thus, the communists, who do not believe in human nature, but only in the human condition, believe that propaganda is all powerful, legitimate whenever they employ it, and instrumental in creating a new type of man. American sociologists scientifically try to play down the effectiveness of propaganda because they cannot accept the idea that the individual, that cornerstone of democracy, can be so fragile. And because they retain their ultimate trust in man. Personally, I too tend to believe the preeminence of man and consequently in his invincibility. Nevertheless, as I observe the facts, I realize that man is terribly malleable, uncertain of himself, ready to accept and to follow many suggestions, and is tossed about by all the winds of doctrine. But when in the course of these pages I shall reveal the full power of propaganda against man, when I advance to the very threshold of showing the most profound changes in his personality, it does not mean I am anti-democratic. The strength of propaganda reveals, of course, that one of the most dangerous flaws of democracy, but that has nothing to do with my own opinion. If I am in favor of democracy, I can only regret that propaganda renders the true exercise of it almost impossible. That propaganda But I think that it would be even worse to entertain any illusions about a coexistence of true democracy and propaganda. Nothing is worse in times of danger than to live in a dream world. To warn a political system of the menace hanging over it does not imply an attack against it, but is the greatest service one can render the system. The same goes for man. To warn him of his weakness is not to attempt to destroy him, but rather to encourage him to strengthen himself. I have no sympathy for the haughty aristocratic intellectual who judges from high, believing himself invulnerable to the destructive forces of his time, and disdainfully considers the common people as cattle to be manipulated, to be molded by the actions of propaganda in the most intimate aspects of their being. I insist that to give such warning is an act in the defense of man, that I am not judging propaganda with Olympian detachment, and that having suffered, felt, and analyzed the impact of the power of propaganda on myself, having been time and time again, and still being the object of propaganda, I want to speak at it. I want to speak of it as a menace which threatens the total personality, which it definitely is. It breaks down your personhood in a very distinct and recognizable way. In order to delineate the real dimensions of propaganda, we must always consider it within the context of civilization. Perhaps the most fundamental defect of most studies made on the subject is their attempt to analyze propaganda as an isolated phenomenon. This corresponds to the rather prevalent attitude that separates socio-political phenomenon from each other and of not establishing any correlation between parts, an attitude that in turn reassures the study an attitude that in turn reassures the student of the validity of the various systems. Democracy, for example, is studied as if the citizen were an entity separate from the state, as if public opinion were a thing in itself. Meanwhile, the scientific study of public opinion and propaganda is left to other specialists, and the specialists in public opinion in turn rely on the jurists to define a suitable legal framework for democracy. The problems of the technological society are studied without reference to their possible influence on mental and emotional life. The labor movement is examined without attention to the changes brought about by psychological means, and so on. Again, I want to emphasize that the study of propaganda must be conducted within the context of the technological society. Propaganda is called upon to solve problems created by technology, to play on maladjustments, and to integrate the individual into a technological world. Propaganda is a good deal less a political weapon of a regime. It is also that than the effect of a technological society that embraces the entire man and tends to be completely integrated society. At the present time, propaganda is the innermost and most elusive manifestation of this trend. Propaganda must be seen as situated at the center of the growing powers of the state and government and administrative techniques. People keep saying everything depends on what kind of state makes use of propaganda. But if we really have understood the technological state, such a statement becomes meaningless. In the midst of increasing mechanization and technological organization, propaganda is simply the means used to prevent these things from being felt as too oppressive and to persuade man to submit with good grace. When man will be fully adapted to this technological society, when he will end by obeying with enthusiasm, convinced of the excellence of what he is forced to do, the constraint of the organization will no longer be felt by him. The truth is, it will no longer be a constraint, and the police will have nothing to do. The civic and technological goodwill and the enthusiasm for the right social myths, both created by propaganda, will finally have solved the problem of man. So I think that's a really good place to end on. I will move on to the first chapter because that's pretty long. I'll move on to that next time. But essentially, it gives an idea of what it is he's looking at and how he's going to approach the subject, because it's a very difficult subject to actually study. It's not the simplest thing. Let me see. There's a lot of good highlighted stuff. I think when I redo and like re-edit it, I'm just going to pull out the highlighted pieces, but it's good to have the complete book available to just go through, as there's a lot to learn. Let's see. How long is the first chapter? Let's see. The first chapter. Oh, the first chapter is really big. I think the first chapter I'll probably do, because it's about, the first chapter of the book is about 87 pages. So I'll probably do like a continuous stream of the first chapter, but then I'll break it up when I actually republish it. Okay. I hope you enjoyed this stream, and we'll be back later for more reading of propaganda to actually get into it. I really like this. Let me know in the comments below what you think, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and follow me on all my different platforms. I really like using X nowadays. It's like one of the few places that you can actually be more open and honest about things. So thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.